Okay, good evening and welcome. I'm David Wood from the Pacific Science Centre, and I'll be your host for tonight's virtual Science in the City talk. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm coming to you live from my bedroom, once again, right here in Seattle. But thank you for connecting with us. We really appreciate you. Before we start tonight's talk, I'd like to share a few bits of information. We've uploaded some of our past Science in the City talks. That includes our 420 talk about cannabis titled What Are You Smoking? Demystifying Cannabis Regulations and Testing. 2 days later was Earth Day, where we were joined by Dr. Peter Kahn, who's an eco-psychologist at the University of Washington, in his talk titled Earth Day, Now More Than Ever, Into Nature and Towards Life. We've also uploaded last week's Science in the City with Dr. Atom Leshak, who is a neuroscientist, and that topic was titled Sugar Addiction, Too Much of a Good Thing. So for those past talks, plus a number of others, can be found on the Science in the City tab on PacSci's YouTube page. So I encourage everyone to give those a look following tonight's lecture. We've also got some excellent upcoming Science in the City talks on Tuesday evenings at 7 p.m. right here on the PacSci YouTube channel. Upcoming talks include 2020 Strikes Again, Murder Hornets, as if 2020 hasn't been harrowing enough. So next Tuesday on June the 2nd, we're going to be joined by Dr. Chris Looney, who's an entomologist at the Washington State Department of Agriculture. Dr. Looney will be discussing the basics of the Asian giant hornet, the risk they pose to local wildlife and the economy, plus current efforts underway to eradicate the pest from our region. The week after that, that's going to be on Tuesday, June the 9th, same time, same place. We're going to be discussing urban ecology with Dr. Chris Schell, who is a professor at the University of Washington, Tacoma. So Dr. Schell will be talking to us about urban coyotes, who have obviously undergone a lot of changes in their behaviors, thanks to the changes in our behaviors as humans during social isolation. He'll also be discussing broadening participation in the natural sciences. To stay in the loop about upcoming Science in the City talks and to stay connected with local scientists and experts, sign up for our e-newsletter at pacsci.org/SITC. That's pacsci.org/SITC. Educational programming like this is made possible in part thanks to the generous support of donors. In the face of challenges like COVID-19 and climate change, science and an informed public are absolutely essential. If you're able to, as part of tonight's event, we suggest a $10 donation to help us ensure that curiosity never closes. But for more information about donating to the Pacific Science Center, visit pacsci.org/support. Tonight's event, the US Space Force sounds like something straight out of science fiction and is even the subject of an upcoming Netflix comedy series titled Space Force, starring Steve Carell. However, the real life establishment of the US Space Force in 2019 signifies the beginning of a new reality for us all. To discuss the reality of war in outer space, we're joined by Dr. Saadia Pekkanen, a Job and Gertrude Tamaki endowed professor at the University of Washington, where she works on outer space policy, law, and security. She's the co-founding director of the University of Washington Space Policy and Research Center. Her expertise is in Japanese and Asian international relations, and she serves as co-chair of the US-Japan Space Forum. She's a contributor for Forbes on the space industry and has published a half dozen books on space technology and geopolitics. Tonight, she'll explain the three deeply intertwined trends of the new space race: democratization, commercialization, and militarization, and why those three trends may indicate that we're headed on a path towards conflict. She'll explain why each trend presents a different set of problems for peaceful prospects in outer space, and why a clear understanding of these problems and their complex linkages is vital as the US Space Force works to avert conflict in the years ahead. As ever, you've already been doing so, but please say hi to everyone in the YouTube comments section. Let us know how you're feeling today. Let us know if you've got a question, a comment, any thoughts about today's talk, because following Dr. Pekkanen's presentation, we'll be doing a Q&A. So let us know how you're feeling, thoughts, questions. We'd love to hear from you and connect with you. So without further ado, please welcome to the live stream, Dr. Saadia Pekkanen. How's it going, Saadia? Hi.
Hello. Very nice to see you, David. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
Let me just make sure that I can share the screen. And we are. All right. Well, thank you very much. I want to just begin, first of all, by thanking David Wood for inviting me to this talk. And I also want to thank the Pacific Science Center for hosting it. And I'm very deeply grateful for those of you who have come out today to really hear me talk about the US Space Force. So the US Space Force has gotten, as David just mentioned, a lot of attention in the popular and cultural spheres, particularly with the launch of the Space Force on Netflix that is going to be coming up. And what I want to do is to just step back and talk a little bit about the US Space Force, where it's coming from, how it's situated in new realities, what is different from the past, and what kinds of things we can expect in terms of space conflict sort of going forward. So let me begin, first of all, with the US Space Force. So yes, as David pointed out, it is here. It started off in December 2019. It is now a part of the armed forces of the United States. And the way that we think about this is that the Space Force is to the Air Force what the Marine Corps are to the Navy. And this is the official website of the United States Space Force. And I thought it would be helpful for us to sort of begin with how it is actually defining its own mission. What is it that it is interested in doing? So the US Space Force is a military service. It's now official. It organizes, trains, and equips space forces in order to protect US and allied interests in space and to provide space capabilities to the joint force. What I want to do in the remainder of this talk is really think with you and reflect with you a little bit about the mission of the USSF. How has it come about? What is different about it? How is it distinguished in the new space race? And what makes the new space race so different from the old space race? And where is this all going forward with respect to space conflict in particular? So let me begin, first of all, with the old space race. And I think that this is a very familiar story to most Americans. This is a story with which we are very, very comfortable. It was there were two players. It was the United States and the Soviet Union. And we knew what was at stake. We knew what they were doing in terms of technologies. We knew the geopolitical context in which they were operating. And we sort of had a sense for who won and who lost in the context of the old space race. So from the time that the Sputnik launches in 1957 to the time that the Americans actually land on the moon, we know that the United States had preeminence in space and ended up dominating that particular race itself. So that is the race and the context which has continued, I think, to shape some of the ways that we think about the new space race. But what I want to discuss with you next is that the new space race is very different from the old space race. And it's not a story that's very easy to tell. And the question is, what kind of a story is it? And I'm going to try and give you a framework to think about how it links to the old space race and what sort of distinguishes it going forward. And what I want to say about the new space race is that it really represents in some ways both the best of times and also the worst of times. And as I go through the talk, that is going to sort of become clearer. So what is at stake from the perspective of the United States is really nothing less than the great power status of this country, and perhaps more than any other country that's around. And again, I will explain a little bit about why that may be and how that may have galvanized the formation of something like the US Space Force itself. So the way that we think about the new space race today is by thinking about at least three different prongs that David already, of course, hinted at, but that I think help us to think about the many different strands, the many different players, the many different technologies that are out there that can affect how this race is going to unfold. There is the trend of democratization, which means that there are many new players that are at the table. These are countries that you would never think about are actually have any kind of a stake in the new space race. And I'll tell you a little bit about these countries in the next few slides as well. But let me finish up this framework. The second, I think, the prong that we need to think about in the new space race is really commercialization. And when people think about commercialization of space, they're really thinking about some of the giants in the field that are really remapping our understanding of space technologies and where they may be headed. So SpaceX, Blue Origin, so on and so forth. And then finally, there is this trend of militarization. And this is the trend that people do tend to focus on when they're thinking about the Space Force. And the idea here is that you have to deal with offensive and defensive operations in the context of what's going on in space activities in orbit. And I would put it to you that it's not very useful to think about any one of these trends in isolation. If you're going to talk about building peace and sustainability, you really have to keep all these prongs of the space race and at the back of your mind. And they have to be balanced for if we are going to be able to convincingly bring people to the table and to forge sort of a lasting peace in outer space. So let me take each of these in turn and sort of give you a sense of how they're playing out in the real world. And let me begin, first of all, with this trend of democratization, by which we mean new and different kinds of players, all kinds of players really coming to the table. So we are no longer just talking about the major space powers. Yes, USA and Russia, of course, very prominent players historically and even today. But we're also talking about players China, India, Japan. As you may know, China has already landed on the dark side of the moon. India is sending up 104 satellites at once, and Japan is carrying out asteroid sample return missions billions of kilometers away. So these are very important and major space powers, but we are not just talking about these major space powers today. We are also talking about countries. There's about an estimated 80 or so countries, and often these are countries that are coming to the table in ways that we did not quite anticipate or did not quite think about them having stakes in the space race, in the new space race. So I want to give you a few examples of how this is playing out around the world. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I can't obviously do every country, but I do want to give you a sense of a few countries around the world that have drawn attention. For example, here is South Africa, which has been designated the Space Weather Center for Africa. And the South Africa National Space Agency is really going to play a vital role in providing space weather services for the continent of Africa. Here, for example, is the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, which has already sent an astronaut to the International Space Station. And they are recruiting their next batch of astronauts. And at the moment, the UAE is involved in also sending up an interplanetary Mars probe in partnership with the help of the Japanese. In fact, the UAE team, I believe, is right now on the ground in Japan already. Here is Israel, another country, a technology powerhouse in the Middle East, and perhaps the story is not known, but Israel also has attempted to go to the moon. Last year, it was almost successful in landing a lunar lander on the moon. Bereshit, I think it's called, and Genesis, and that presented an opportunity to build bigger and a better lander this time around. And I think the Israelis are going to continue with that mission as well. And finally, let me also suggest some ways in which, space race strands are coming to the table that were perhaps not anticipated. You may have heard of China and its Belt and Road initiatives, which is to create a global infrastructure network of ports and highways and railways and so on and so forth. Now, what is I think not very well known is that China is also interested in creating a space corridor along with the countries in which it is engaged in its Belt and Road initiative. So Pakistan, there is something called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and Pakistan has just recently sent up satellites with the help of China as well. So those are the kinds of strands spread all around the world when we're thinking about democratization. Who's a player? What are they doing? What are their motives? This is the kind of picture that we have to keep in mind. And as I said, these are just a few countries. There's so many others. For example, Luxembourg is interested in the regulatory mission of space mining and space resources. Turkey is interested in creating its own space agency, and so on and so forth. So democratization is a very important part of the framework that I think we need to keep in mind. And then, of course, there's the commercialization angle that we also have to keep at the back of our minds. There is unquestionably a new generation of space entrepreneurs. This is a global economy that is now worth over $400 billion in 2018, and is projected to go between 1 to 3 trillion by the 2050s. Now, nobody can tell you whether these rosy projections are going to come to pass, but what we can see is some pretty boundary pushing innovations and technologies, some of them from players in Washington State, Blue Origin, Spaceflight, Tethers Unlimited. And I would be remiss if I did not mention SpaceX, which may be making history tomorrow, 27th May. So I'm sure that for the people who are listening, this is probably old news, but I do encourage everybody to take a look at what SpaceX may be doing tomorrow. I think it's 4:33 p.m. Eastern time, and then about 1:30 here. What they are doing is returning human space flight, as they say, to the United States. We've been hitching rides with the Russians ever since our space shuttle was retired. And what this is actually going to do is to allow American astronauts to get up and down from the space station from American soil and on American rockets. And I do want to also mention that there will be a SpaceX launch watch party over at the Museum of Flight. So my colleagues will be involved in that. I encourage you to go online and to join the fun and see what happens tomorrow. I know I will certainly be watching that keenly. So those are some of the strands of the commercialization angles that are very important. So now at this point, you're thinking, well, democratization, commercialization trends seem like the best of times. I mean, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that they also, affect our characterization of space. They affect the fact that space becomes congested, it becomes competitive, and it becomes contested. So there are also challenges, for example, associated with democratization, right? The more players you have, the more varied the interests that are coming to the table. And the more difficult it is to build consensus on what the underlying rules and principles should be that should be governing behavior in outer space. With commercialization, there's also a challenge. It may well be that governments want to champion their own national champions and national industries. And as industry heads out in space, the flag may follow economics in outer space, and that can potentially clash, as history has actually taught us. And most important of all, I think there are two kinds of risk because of all this congestion and all this competitiveness that are coming to the table. They're also fueling militarization. All the things that we are putting into space today are not just going into, if you'll pardon me, into some sort of a vacuum. We've already been there over 50 plus years. So there's already a lot of space junk there. So the first risk that sort of propels us towards militarization is this risk of space debris. And a second risk that I also want to discuss with you is this risk of the return of great power competition. So let me discuss both those risks because they play into why we are seeing the formation and the rise of something like the US Space Force. So I don't know what your vision is of what space looks like, but in reality, this is what space debris looks like in outer space. These are some computer-generated images from NASA, and this is leftover from human ventures. These are things like discarded boosters, satellite fragments, paint flecks, lost gloves, what have you, that is just floating around in space, but doing so at lethally fast speeds. Now, I don't know if you ever saw that movie Gravity, but they have, there's many things you can quibble about that movie. You might think, but one of the things that I think it did exceptionally well, that it left such a strong sensation and a strong picture of what happens when space debris hits and affects space assets and also human missions. So this is not something that can go away anytime soon, but it is a problem that is important in thinking about the mission of the Space Force. So NASA estimates that these figures are always changing, but there's likely increasing. There's between 500,000 pieces between 1 to 10 centimeters and hundreds of millions of pieces, smaller than 1 centimeter. Nobody really knows, but the risks are increasing. And these are risks for the safety and security of space assets that affect all stakeholders in space, civilian, commercial, military, but they do so especially for the United States. Why? Why do they especially affect the United States? Well, one way to think about this is to think about the total number of satellites that we have in space. I think this is the most excellent database, the Union of Concerned Scientists. They put out this database regularly, they update it. As of March 2020, we had about 2,666 operating satellites. So if you look at the United States, it's almost half of the total operating satellites out there. That's a huge amount of dependence on space assets. And you will notice that of these US satellites, a lot of them are actually commercial. So that's about 70% are actually commercial. But there are, of course, very important government and military satellites as well. So it's not just that the US Space Force is interested in the military. Really, what it needs to protect and make safe and sustainable in partnership with allies is the protection of these assets and making sure that space remains safe, secure, and sustainable. The problem is that risk can be, of course, accidental. We all realize that as the amount of space debris increases, you can get collisions between between real satellites. And so we did have a collision in 2009 between US and Russian satellites that created debris. But the risks are not just about accidents increasing. The risks are also deliberate because there are, in 2007, for example, China carried out an anti-satellite test, which created massive amounts of debris. But China is not alone. India has also carried out an anti-satellite test in 2019 that also created debris. So the potential for debris, the fact that we are commercializing space, the fact that we are sending up more and more small satellites, that the US is going to become more, not less dependent on space assets, is of course a concern from the national security point of the US. So in some senses, this is also the worst of times, right? Because space debris really exposes a vulnerability of highly dependent space power. So in the US case, this is 50% of the total. This is very serious. And as I said, this is likely to increase if the commercial trends stay on course the way that they are going. But you also realize as I'm talking that space debris is an opportunity for rivals to affect the great power status of the USA because space assets fuel the civilian, commercial, and military way of life of the United States. It is also a deliberate target for potential peer competitors. And the fact that cleanup technologies can also be used for military purposes, because really all space technology, I would say, well, 95% at least is dual use. So it can be used both for commercial, civilian, and then also military purposes. So those are some of the strands that we have to balance and know about from a national security space standpoint. These risks, of course, are also amplified by the geopolitical flux today, which further increases the prospects for space. I think I've been saying all along that the US has sort of come back to a world of great power competition, and it has named really China and Russia as peer competitors. The naming of these competitors, of course, also affects the way that the US relates to its allies, as well how it operates in the context of its alliances. The other big thing is, of course, that space has been declared a war-fighting domain more openly than it's ever been. And China, for example, has simply said that the extension of conflict to the space domain is inevitable. The USA is preparing for space control and battle management systems. So this is the context in which the militarization prong of the framework that I gave you at the beginning is also carrying on. And this brings us back to the US Space Force, I think very nicely, with all these risks, both technical, coming from the framework, but also geopolitical. And, I think the USSF puts it best itself. It says that space has become essential to our security and prosperity. We do need to defend it. We need unfettered access to space in the interest of national defense, and it's woven into the fabric of our way of life, from your GPS technology and your surfing, our connections during this pandemic, our ability of first responders to be able to communicate. All those things really do rely very heavily on space assets. So that is one of the main reasons one of the main ways in which the Space Force is likely to engage with dealing with threats and risks in outer space. But I would add that the USSF is not the only one of its kind. China, Russia, Japan, India all have some version of the Space Force. And this is not a trend that is going to go back, I think, for the foreseeable future. So building peace in this context, where every country is interested in managing those risks, perhaps through technical means or perhaps through building alliances, is something that the Space Force in the US will have to keep its eyes on. So let me put some reflections for us to think about as we think about where all this is headed. I would say that given the realities of the new space race, technological and military solutions are certainly necessary, but they're just not going to be sufficient. There are too many tendrils to the new space race, and there are too many players for just technical solutions alone to be able to dominate. So the US will likely need both deterrence strategies and then also diplomacy in building out alliances and partnerships with like-minded partners. And closer to home, I think this would be a good chance for me to tell you that one of our educational missions is the mission of thinking about how we can build peaceful prospects in outer space. So this is through Spark at the University of Washington. And I want to leave you with this slide at the end, just to tell you to please contact us. We'll be doing programming in the years ahead. We hope to connect back to the Pacific Science Center and to your audiences as well. And with that, let me end and just thank you all for reflecting on this topic with me. And I hope that you will be part of the Spark story here in Seattle as we try to build awareness of building peace in space. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Saadia. We really look forward to welcoming you and Spark and everyone to the Science Center when it's safe to do so. Thank you so much for your talk today as well.
Of course.
Now I've got one more thing to be neurotic about.
Of course. No, you should not be neurotic. No, we're in good hands. No, please don't.
Okay. Well, thank you for everyone who's tuning in at home. We've been getting some great questions and comments. We've got folks tuning in from as far away as Texas.
Wow.
We've got folks tuning in from a little bit close to home in Tacoma and Gig Harbor in Washington. So that's really lovely.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, and again, if you're watching from home and you got a question for Dr. Pekkanen, please leave that below or just let us know how you're doing today. We really want to hear from you and connect with you. Saadia, I'm going to start with a question from YouTube.
Of course.
And this is about tomorrow's launch.
Yes.
So what should we as lay people be looking for during tomorrow's
party? So I think that this is a really hugely important event for the US. So as you know, we've been hitching rides with the Russians ever since the space shuttle was retired. But Falcon 9 and this demonstration crew that is going to the space station, hopefully, will really return the ability of the United States to take ferry its own astronauts back and forth to the space station, but then also begin to think much more seriously about beyond that. So as you know, we have a mission to also go to the moon. And I believe Elon Musk also has a mission to go to Mars. But this, I think, is a very important step in sort of thinking about what kind of space companies are going to be part of the new space race in terms of reusable launch technology. So you should look out for, let's see, how the reusability works, and let us hope that the astronauts make it safely to the space station, to the International Space Station.
So the key things to watch for is hopefully those astronauts are safe and sound.
Yes.
In the ISS.
Yes, I hope so. Yes, and then the other thing is that I believe that this is a technical demonstration. So after this, I think they will be good to go in terms of working with NASA on launching more astronauts. And the other thing I should caution you is that there is a launch window tomorrow, of course, but if we miss the launch window, I believe that the next one is on Sunday. So just in case you miss tomorrow, you can also come back to it. If you miss the launch itself, I'm sure no matter what happens, there will be some sort of update on the SpaceX website as well. So I would watch that.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that with us.
Of course.
Another question we've gotten from our viewers online: what are the prospects for a UN-driven governing framework for space, analogous to the UN Convention for the Law of the Sea? Is there enough political appetite for this among space actors?
Yeah, an excellent question. So I'm so glad you asked this question. I'm just teaching a space law and policy class. I have a number of students who are, of course, grappling with exactly this same issue. I would say that there is, of course, a framework in place. The question is, as these trends of democratization, commercialization, and militarization come forward in greater and greater force, that whole system is sort of put under strain. And the question for many people is about the interpretation of some of the principles that are within this framework that's been existing for most of the duration of the space age. It took a long time to sort of put into place. And it would be terrible if it would just go away. But the person who has asked this question is asking a very important question, because we are in an era where international treaties, international law is sort of on the decline. Countries are withdrawing from many of these treaties and conventions, and there's no appetite really to negotiate new kinds of things. So it's all the more important to hang on to some of the foundational principles that we have, such as to do with peaceful prospects in space, perhaps fleshing that out and thinking about that more carefully in terms of norms of behavior. But yes, it's absolutely correct. We don't have any appetite for negotiating any kinds of new treaties. I don't see that happening anytime soon, but I do see frameworks being built on some of those principles that are already existing under the auspices of the United Nations.
Thank you for that. Another question that kind of builds on that we just received: what treaties currently exist for the peaceful use of space? I know that with 5G satellites, is putting GPS at risk, is what the person's commented, and that they're too close to the current radiation spectrum. So what can you say about the treaties that currently exist for the peaceful use of space, and tell us a little bit more about how 5G maybe plays into that?
5G network. So I don't know about the 5G network, but we have about 5 space treaties that are already in place under the auspices of the UN. The most central of this is a treaty called the Outer Space Treaty, which goes back to 1967. It has some foundational rules. And then you have a host of other treaties that deal with liability, registration, return of astronauts, and so on and so forth. And those are the treaties that we have in place. And effectively what happens is that the sort of principles that we have in the foundational treaty, for example, ideas about national appropriation of assets in space, ideas about military uses of outer space, those actually come to us from the foundational treaty. And they sort of infuse the spirits of the other treaties that actually do follow. There is one final treaty, the Moon Treaty, but it doesn't have many signers. So, that makes it not so relevant from the perspective of international law for the people who have not signed it. I think the problem more is that we're at the system where we have international law in place, but we also have national regulations going into place about how we should be gathering resources from outer space, for example. So this system of national regulation, I've said earlier that because of this democratization, we have so many different players coming to the table. Can the outer space structure that we have under the UN, can that play a role in helping to bring all these other countries together through their national regulations? I think that's the question that we want to be. Are those same principles going to be infused and interpreted in like ways across all these countries who want to do their own thing, given where we are? So I think that's the challenge going forward. And I'm sorry, I don't really have any comment on the 5G question, so I'm going to pass on that one. Sorry. Yeah.
Is UN governance of space somewhat similar to climate change? Do you see parallels between the climate movement and the space movement? And is there a similar UN space conference as there is for, say, climate change?
Yeah, so the UN does run its own conferences. It regularly meets. It has both a legal committee and a technical committee. It's called the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. There's that whole rubric. There's also something on the Committee on Disarmament, but that Committee on Disarmament, which is supposed to deal also with military issues, is a little bit more moribund. So I'm not as well aware of what the structure of the climate, the international environmental law looks like, but the treaties under the COPUAs for the countries that have signed them, those are hard legal obligations. So that may be very different from the kind of legal structure that you might be seeing under the climate change or under international environmental law.
Thank you for that. Another question from online. What are prospects for multilateral, multinational efforts to clean up space debris? It seems it would be in the best interest of the large space powers, the big historical polluters, to take the lead in cleaning it up. So who's going to take that cleaning job by the scruff of the neck?
An excellent question. And I think this is the question that both the technology, some technology companies, as well as the regulatory and legal framework is really attempting to deal with. There are a number of complications. So the answer to the question right away is that we do have some guidelines in place. There is an interagency debris coordinating committee that brings together the space agencies, and there are certain guidelines. They're voluntary, they're in place. So for example, there's a rule that you have to retire your satellite in 25 years or so. If you're taking it up, you should think about what it's going to be doing in 25 years. The problem is twofold. One is that the technology that is supposed to get rid of the space debris can also be a space weapon, so to speak. So the technology that goes out to inspect and look at the space debris or your satellite, to drag it out of the environment, can also do that for a functioning asset. So that's a complication and a function of the technology itself. The other complication, I think, is a little bit more legal and regulatory. Countries have and continue to exercise supervising authority of every piece of debris that's out there. So if you have a piece of debris that's out there, let's say that it's an American booster that's been left in space, that belongs to me. I don't want some company from some country from somewhere else to come and take that away. So I'm not saying that those problems are not insurmountable, but those are things that we need to keep at the back of our minds when we're thinking about building that regime out. But we're at the situation in the US where we're talking about something called space traffic management, I think is the way that we can kind of think about this in terms of the, cars on a road. You have to have some safety precautions. And there is something taking place called Confers, where government agencies, as well as companies and other stakeholders, are coming together to think about how to build those rules for space traffic management in space. The requirements to do so are Herculean, both technically, but also from a legal and policy perspective. So we'll keep an eye for where that goes. Perhaps there might be some multilateral agreement, but we'll wait and see. I think this is going to be something that we figure out as we go along.
So there could be space traffic warden.
Yes. But who will be the warden? That's the question, right? Yeah. So who will be the warden, and who would agree that that would be the warden? So I think that you do have to keep I always say this to people, but I think that in many ways, outer space affairs are rooted in the geopolitics on Earth. The problem that you think you're trying to fix in space is not a problem that can be fixed in space. It has to be fixed through diplomacy and partnerships and linkages back down on Earth. So it's not just a technical solution, it's that geopolitical solution as well that I think the US Space Force should be sort of thinking about as well. Yeah.
Thank you. One of the questions we've had is, why do we need so many satellites? So could you just the importance of space and what's out there? Why are we so dependent on it, and why is it so important that we protect it?
Yeah, so excellent question. Sorry that this was perhaps not as clear as I could have made it. Our entire way of life is really affected by this critical space infrastructure. So when you're back out in the world and you need your GPS to go somewhere, that's actually run by GPS satellites that are at the moment, run through the military. When you are going to the bank and withdrawing money, that system also runs through outer space. When you're pumping gas, that's also through outer space. So banking, finance, first responder things, looking at what's going on the ground, that's all taking place through space assets. Nevertheless, the questioner is extremely, I think, asking an extremely important question, because honestly, I don't know what is a good answer to how many satellites we need. Right now, we're not just talking about huge satellites, we're talking about small satellites that are supposed to be launched into low Earth orbit. And over the next 10, 15 years, the projections are that it will be about 20 to 30,000 satellites. Now, you can imagine that with the space debris and the fact of these small satellites, the collision is going to be increasing. Nobody's really sort of regulating, what is going on from a global perspective. So there's no good answer to how many are necessary, but what we do know is that a lot of them are going up. So SpaceX has also launched its own constellation, and a number of other companies are also going to continue to do the same. That also increases the risk of collisions in space, is the point that I would make.
So, speaking of SpaceX, we've got a question about them. You said that the goal, this is one of the questions from our audience. You said that the goal of SpaceX is to bring, one of the goals is to bring space travel back to the US.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like commercialization can exacerbate nationalism in space.
Yes.
So how do we keep this from becoming a winner-take-all type scenario?
So, excellent question. And this is exactly what I was saying when I was talking about the commercialization trend. On the one hand, it sounds terrific that we have these really groundbreaking technologies that are really remapping the way that we think about space technology altogether. But on the other hand, they do pose challenges, right? Because this means that the governments have an incentive to push their own companies and their own national champions. And we're at the point with the trend of democratization at play that it's not just the US or Russia or Japan or China or India. Everybody wants to do it. Realistically, of course, very few countries and very few players will survive, but it does give governments a chance to get into the game and to really, I think correctly, as your questioner points out, lead to space nationalism in some ways, which can be very detrimental going forward. But I think historically, that is something that we absolutely need to keep an eye on as things move forward. The question for us is, will it be different in outer space? And honestly, David, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm a trained political scientist, so I feel like not sure about that one. Yeah.
We'll just have to live with that uncertainty.
Yes, we do have to live with it. But you can see techno-nationalism, you can see space nationalism. Every country wants to be, a space nation. There's no question that that is true. Some will succeed and some will not. And I suspect that a lot of these companies will succeed in partnership with their governments. The risks are just too huge in space for any one company to be able to do it. So this does mean, that governments will have to eventually confront each other. This is reasonably foreseeable. So that is, a whole part of the equation that I think we do definitely need to keep our eyes on moving forward.
Thank you for that. Another question online, which kind of builds on that slightly, is what are the political implications of a private company, so a SpaceX or a Blue Origin or companies that violate international space agreements? What would be the difference between them violating international space agreements and, say, the governments of member nations directly violating them?
So one basic principle of the international space law that we have is something called a launching state has supervising continuing authority on any action taken by any entity that's under its supervision. So every country must license a launch. Every country must license the satellite and spacecraft that goes. So really, we are talking, it's a system of public international law that we have in place. And I think that one of my colleagues, I think correctly, has pointed out that going forward, this system of public international law is important because it focuses on government. But as more and more commercial players come into the system, we may have a bigger role for national courts to deal with torts and liability going forward. And that's something that I think we also need to keep an eye on as we move forward in this role. I mean, international space law certainly has the ability, but it's really state to state level that we're talking about. It's a system of public international law.
Okay. We've got quite a blunt question here. If we do come, if a space war materializes, who do you think would be the key players, and who do you think the US might be aligned with?
I think that that's also an excellent question. I think that this is probably what the leadership of the Space Force is really trying to figure out. So the US, of course, has its alliances. And one of the things that it's, I'll speak for the US. I think one of the things that it's doing is that it is trying to build linkages and partnerships with its allies. So for example, the US is doing a great deal with Japan in order to try to make space safe, sustainable, and secure. What I will say is that nobody's going to win. There's no victory. I mean, think about this. We have been in a war for 20 years or so, isn't it, on the ground? It's been hard to declare what a victory is in that particular case. So I'm not sure what victory looks like in outer space. What I can understand is what safety and security and sustainability might look like in outer space. And so that is not something that any one country can sort of achieve on its own. That is something that you're going to have, and it's not a technical solution either. I think that this has to be done really in partnership with allies and partners moving forward. And so I think that I will leave it at that. I'm not going to make any predictions about who is going to win what war. I hope that no war and no conflict starts. I think that that's what you want to sort of move towards.
Well, moving away from that aspect of things, how optimistic are you that in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, that in the very immediate future, do you foresee any conflict arising, or do you foresee things to be as they have been, which for the most part has been fairly cooperative? And correct me if I'm wrong in any
No, that's perfectly. So I would say, there is a split that is actually happening, as from what we can sort of see what's happening on the ground, is that you are seeing sort of a China-led space order and sort of a US-led space order. And the question is, do these two countries need to sit down and sort of realistically say, we need to think about what is going on in space and where do we want to be positioned a few years from now. Look, uncertainty is a huge part of the equation. Just take a look at what's happened with the pandemic. Was anybody prepared for this? No, right? So I think there's some things that we can see that are reasonably foreseeable for leadership in the US and also China and other countries to come to the table and begin to think realistically about averting the sort of catastrophe that is not really going to serve anyone's interest. So talk of domination and deterrence, it sounds very good but I think building it in practice, that's tough to do. It's not going to be possible without really dealing with the geopolitics, as I said, down here. So am I optimistic or pessimistic? As a scholar, I can afford to be neither. I just monitor the trends and I monitor the dots and I try to connect them. Right now, I would say that we're in a situation where militarization, the whole triangle is sort of shifting towards the militarization prong. And that to me is a very, very worrying trend. Can there be a space, can there be some sort of a conflict in the sense that we get an accident or we get something deliberate? It's entirely possible. It's entirely possible. And I think that's the role that the United States Space Force is really there to deal with. As they define their mission, as they think about how they're going to move forward, those are some of the realities with which they're going to have to contend.
Well, thank you for those answers. And thank you everyone who's been submitting questions. We've got time for a couple more because everyone's been submitting such thoughtful questions, if you're okay.
Yes, amazing.
Aside from historical precedent, what distinguishes a space power from a mere space actor? And is this even a useful paradigm anymore, given the trends that you've described?
An excellent question. That is something that I will think about, but let me reflect a little bit with you on what I think about when I think about a space power. When I think about a space power, I think about a country that has the ability to be able to independently get in and out of space. It has to have its own rockets and the ability to be able to launch them. It should have the ability, and not every country can do that, right? There are very handful of countries that can really do that. Most countries are dependent on other players, and maybe the commercial part will change some of it, but again, I think it will be more realistically in partnership with countries that have to license those launches. I guess the other thing I would say is, that looking forward, we are in an era where you have to think, of course, small satellites are important, spacecraft are important, but then also things like establishing the potential to establish off-world habitats might also be important, right? So we're beginning to see some of that in partnership with the commercial companies, as NASA is moving forward and as other allies and other space agencies are also moving forward. So that's also an ability, the ability to be able to land something on the moon, right? And to stick it. And so, to be there, to sort of help shape things. That's also something that you have to think about. So when I say that democratization has brought many players to the table, I think this question has raised an excellent point, which is that, how do we distinguish these very sort of the top niche powers from the players who want to advantage and position themselves in niches? And I would say that's how I would distinguish it. The ability to be able to get in and out of space and to be really at the cutting edge of some of the trends that we see coming in terms of spacecraft and off-world habitats. Not every country can do that. So I think that that's the reality of the situation.
We're getting a lot of questions about space debris.
Oh gosh. Okay.
Someone commented that they hadn't even considered that paint flecks could be hazardous in space.
And I don't know how we know that they're there. So I have to ask some of my technical friends about that.
Yeah, wow.
What's the
So some questions are, how long might it take to clean up space debris?
Yes.
How important is it that we do clean up that space debris? And
Yeah.
and who should pay for it?
Oof. Yeah, that is the question. So let me take who should clean it up. Let me start in the reverse. So as I said, there are a number of commercial companies that are coming to the fore. They're interested in building out platforms for cleaning up space debris. We also have companies that are able to go out and inspect and service your satellites in space. So in case they do get hit with space debris, that is, that's a service that we absolutely need. So my guess is that, some of it will have to be paid for, just like you pay for, your services to run your car. It might be like that. And I think that's more the realistic route in a world where commercial and government partnerships are coming to the fore, right? So in terms of who is paying, I think the person who is sending up his or her assets, or the country or the player, you should also be responsible. So you have the ability now to devise systems that may, in fact, deorbit themselves. So maybe you don't end up paying. You build that into the cost of making that platform going forward. But if you're going to ask me that somebody should come along and, we should have some sort of an international consortium that's taxing it, I'm not sure that that will work. I'm not sure that it's feasible. So I think we have to work through the commercial government structures that we already have in place in order to be able to make companies do that cleanup themselves. We may eventually move to that model, but it'll take a little while to get there. Yeah.
Okay, I will leave you with one final question, which,
of course,
which I hope is in your wheelhouse of knowledge. As an expert on Japanese and Asian
yes,
diplomacy,
yes.
what can the US learn from Japan? What might Japan be able to learn from the US?
Excellent. So let me deal with the second one first. In terms of learning, I think one of the things that Japan is learning from the United States is really about the idea of how to clean up space debris. And also about what it takes to sort of clean up space debris and look out for suspicious objects in space. So that's a whole thing that Japan is actually putting into motion now. What can the US learn from Japan? That is also an excellent question. I think that one of the things that the US can learn is the Japanese have had since the early 1990s a forum called the Asia Pacific Space Regional Space Agency Forum, which has been responsible for bringing partners to the table in a voluntary way to build up support for the kinds of norms and principles that are required to operate peacefully in space. So that is something that I'm hoping that in the long run, the US will get involved with, and that it can learn how you sort of build that platform out over really a quarter of a century in order to bring different players with different views to the table and get them to work together. So that's something important for the US to learn as well.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Pekkanen, for sharing
thank you very much.
Your time and your expertise with all of us today.
It's my great pleasure, and thank you for all those excellent questions. I hope that whoever is listening out there, I hope you will be part of our Spark and that you will come and join us. Please join us through the contact portion on our website, and I look forward to meeting you in person. Hoping that we'll have many more such events. And David, again, thank you very much for having me on today. I really appreciated being here.
Oh, you're more than welcome. And I want to echo that statement. Thank you again for everybody who's been watching from home, your thoughtful questions. Fingers crossed that the launch tomorrow is a success.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
We hope you've enjoyed tonight's event. Please let us know. Please give us your feedback by filling out our short survey. It's just a few questions and it's down in the description of this video. We'd love to hear from you. Also, if you've enjoyed tonight's talk, please share it with your friends and families. We're going to be saving this on YouTube, so spread the word. Remember, you can sign up for our e-newsletter at pacsci.org/SITC and donate to the Pacific Science Center at pacsci.org/support. We hope that you'll join us again next week at the same time, same place for 2020 Strikes Again, Murder Hornets with Dr. Chris Looney from the Washington State Department of Agriculture. Thank you for tuning in, and we hope you'll join us again next week. Bye for now.